Welcome back to another video. Today I'm at Melbourne Airport, heading up to Sydney, on board one of Qantas's new A321XLRs. We'll touch on the new stuff to do with this plane, but there's something else I want to touch on. If you've seen any of the news coverage about this plane, you'll be aware of its tremendous range.
The extra long-range Airbus offers the potential of new routes.
This plane has an extra fuel tank, so it can fly much further.
It's all about the extra long range, the potential new routes. Or is it? Over half of Qantas's A321XLRs will be fitted out with a very standard domestic cabin layout. So are these just a replacement for the 737s? And if so, why did they go for the extra long range version? Why not the standard A321 or even the A321LR? Well, let's go fly one to Sydney and try and figure this whole thing out. Also, we've got our first ever video sponsor. Big thanks to Surfshark here, but we'll get to that a bit later in the video. I'm starting this one on the roof of the Terminal 4 car park here at Melbourne. There's good views, not incredible, but if you've got a spare couple of hours, it could be worth wandering up here. Anyway, I've got to get all the way over there. So let's go get our daily steps in. While I wander over to this terminal, I guess let's start with our first question. Let's not dive into the XLR yet. I want to actually start with why they've gone with an A321 over, say, an A320 Neo, obviously, as these are sort of the bigger planes.
If you've ever stepped foot in an Australian airport, then you've almost undoubtedly seen one of these. One of the many Qantas 737-800s that make up the majority of their domestic fleet. There's an interesting backstory on how they ended up choosing the 737-800s in the first place, but we'll get to that a bit later in the video. Either way, if we take a quick look at the narrow-body domestic aircraft currently available today from the two major manufacturers, there's pretty much three buckets. There's small, medium, and large. Qantas has been playing in the medium bucket, but this move to the A321 shifts them up to the large bucket. Why did they do this? Why not go for the A320neo as a replacement for the 737s? Well, the answer is basically Australia. The Australian domestic market is heavily concentrated around incredibly dense, high-yielding routes between the capital cities. There's the aptly named Golden Triangle between Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, and then the incredibly lucrative routes between those East Coast capitals and Perth. Outside of these, there's some busy holiday routes to, say, Cairns or the Gold Coast, and some traffic to Adelaide, Darwin and Hobart, but the majority of the Qantas domestic business is focused on these premium East Coast capitals and Perth. And they have no problems filling planes here. By moving up to the larger A321, they're able to carry 15% more people with only a slight increase in overall trip cost when compared to the older 737s. This will lead to a nice drop in the cost per seat and will likely see them be even more profitable on these routes. Slight tangent here, but the Qantas domestic business is incredibly profitable, at least in the airline world. In their financial results for financial year 2025, they break out the earnings for the domestic and international sides of the business. Despite doing less overall revenue and having emptier planes, domestic makes 77% more EBIT, profit, and has more than double the operating margin. There's probably something to be said here about the duopolistic practices and how we're all paying too much for domestic flights, but that can all wait for another video. For Qantas, upsizing to the A321 appears like the right business move and will allow them to become even more profitable, at least domestically. So we've figured out why they've gone bigger with the A321, but why go for the extra long range variant?
It's almost predictable at this point, but we've got a your flight's been delayed message. Only 15 minutes though, so not too bad.
So why the XLR? Qantas, in a lot of their marketing materials, are pushing how this thing will open up new markets. You may or may not have seen these diagrams. But out of the 48 that they've ordered, 32 are being configured in this very short haul style layout. Standard recliner business class seats, no seatback entertainment, and they've specifically earmarked these as replacements for the 737-800s. 16 are going to be fitted with a longer haul layout, lie flat seats, seatback screens, etc. But these aren't due to arrive until 2028 at the earliest. And well, this just makes things even more interesting. Why order 30 32 of the extra long range variant of this plane if you're just going to use them for domestic flying and as a replacement for the old 737s. The standard A321neo is quite a bit cheaper at list prices. It's just as, if not more efficient to fly, and a simpler plane, meaning it's going to be cheaper to maintain. So what's going on here? Well, I'm going to posit two core reasons for this decision: realistic range and cargo capacities. Let's start with the realistic range. A baseline A321neo has a marketed range of 6,480 kilometers. One of Qantas's bigger domestic markets is east to west coast flying: Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane to Perth. The distance between those cities falls within the 2,700 to 3,600 kilometer range. These are all well under that 6,480 kilometer figure, right? No. A fully loaded standard A321neo cannot consistently make the Brisbane to Perth flight year-round without penalties, or even potentially Sydney to Perth. Why? Am I crazy? Can I not read? Am I stupid?
I am stupid.
No. Here's the breakdown. First, we have to think about flying not in terms of raw kilometers, but in terms of time. There are headwinds and tailwinds that can drastically affect how long flights can take. And for fuel consumption, the engines burn a given amount of fuel per hour. And this gives us our true range. In the case of the standard A321neo, its tanks fit just under 23,500 litres, or around 18,500 kilograms of fuel. And when fully loaded, it typically burns around 2.5 to 2.8 tons of fuel per hour. This gives us around 7 hours of practical flight time after we take into account standard fuel reserve requirements. Now, Brisbane to Perth, the longest of the East Coast to West Coast services, typically has a flight time of just under 5 hours. During the winter months, there's often headwinds that can be up to 100 kilometers an hour, and this can push the flight time to 5.5 or 6 hours. But 6 is still less than 7. 6-7. This should be completely fine for a standard A321neo, right? Well, no, it's not quite that simple. Perth is the most isolated city on Earth. Well, if we're being pedantic here, it's the most remote city with a population greater than 1 million from the nearest city with a population above 100,000. The actual most remote city with a population in excess of 1 million from the nearest city with a population in excess of 1 million is Auckland. Long story short, it's very isolated. Standard airline fuel reserves, having enough spare fuel to account for weather changes, navigational errors, having to hold at the destination airport, or even divert to another airport in the case of poor weather, don't apply here. In the case of Perth and the surrounding area being completely fogged in, the next real alternatives are Kalgoorlie, Exmouth, or even Adelaide. And these are all significant diversions that would see a fully loaded A321neo barely making the distance. Brisbane to Perth is the extreme example here, but the numbers aren't much better either for Sydney to Perth. That route is only 340 kilometers shorter. This means that Qantas, if they'd gone down the A321neo path, could be stuck on extreme headwind days, having to offload passengers or limit their cargo carrying capacity. This is something they would obviously like to avoid if possible, and luckily they can. Airbus makes longer range versions of the A321neo. More specifically, they make the A321LR, the long range, and the XLR, the extra long range. So if they're only just on the edge of the range of a standard A321neo, why aren't they going with the LR? Why jump all the way up to the XLR? Well, it all comes down to design.
Before we get into that, I got a quick word from today's video sponsor, Surfshark. I want to be honest with you guys, before I started doing all of this sort of international travel, I wasn't exactly a VPN type of person, but that all changed on my first trip to China. I remember getting to my hotel room in Shanghai, setting up my laptop, and then bam, nothing worked. Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, even Gmail. And this is where Surfshark VPN comes in. I turn it on and all of a sudden, all of my web traffic is flowing through an encrypted tunnel to a Surfshark server in another country. Because websites only see that final Surfshark server, not my real location, I'm no longer stuck with a geo-blocked or censored version of the web. This was also very handy on my last trip when I was trying to watch F1 in Greece and India. On top of that, there's a security aspect too. When you're browsing on airport, hotel, cafe Wi-Fi, Surfshark adds an extra layer of encryption between you and the web. So whoever runs the network or the ISP, they can't see what you're up to. All they see is encrypted data flowing directly to Surfshark servers. You can rest easy here too. Surfshark operates under a no logs policy, meaning they're not keeping track of what you're up to either. This has been independently audited and verified by Deloitte. So if you want to get protected, I've got some great news for you. If you go to surfshark.com/flight formula, or use the promo code Flight Formula at checkout, you can get an extra 4 months. Thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. Let's now get back to the XLR. So I'm down the back. I am the back right seat today. So there's not quite a new plane smell, but it is definitely very new. Yeah, I mean, the new economy seats, I do have to say, they're pretty nice. I like the color, they're modern. We've got USB-A, USB-C charging. We've got a device tray holder thing. The seat back pocket is large enough. It's already accumulating crumbs. But yeah, the XLR is more about what's happening below the deck, below the floor, right below me, than what's happening above. So let's get into that now.
So why didn't Qantas go for the LR? Well, it all comes down to these things. This is the LD45. There's a few other names for it, but this is the container that fits into the belly of the A320 family of jets. There's a few other sizes. This is the LD3. And this is the LD36. These two fit into the belly of sort of wide-body jets. Think like the 787 Dreamliner, the A380, that sort of thing. My CAD skills went a little bit wild, but they are pretty much to scale, I think. Now, this LD45 that fits into like the A321neo doesn't fit into the 737. Why? Let's touch on that briefly. Why can't the 737 use these containers? Well, it all comes down to the original design. Boeing created the 737 in the mid-60s as a short-haul jet that could operate from fairly basic airports. They deliberately gave it very short landing gear and a low-to-the-ground fuselage. This was so that bags could be loaded by hand in cases where ground equipment wasn't available. This early design decision meant that even after decades of developments, containers just don't and won't fit. Airbus and the A320 came along almost 20 years later, and they designed the fuselage specifically to fit these containers. I guess this raises another question. Why even use containers in the first place? They add extra weight and to some degree limit how much stuff you can shove into the belly of your jet. What's the advantage here? Well, the big thing is that they save time. Baggage handlers no longer need to crawl into the cargo area and stack individual bags. This can all be done behind the scenes at the airport, and then these containers can be quickly loaded into the plane whilst it's on the ground. These containers aren't just for passenger bags too. Airlines are freight businesses. For example, Qantas has a fairly hefty contract with Australia Post to move both domestic and international mail. In this particular case, the containers can be pre-packed at Australia Post's sorting centres and then trucked over to the airport, avoiding the double handling of mail and parcels. With all of that being said though, containers aren't some logistical golden bullet. In countries with low labour costs, airlines may decide to forego them altogether and just load A320s by hand. But all in all, this is just another reason why the 737's design is well past its use-by date and in desperate need for a clean sheet replacement. But let's not dive too deep into the 737 here. Let's get back to the fuel tanks. Firstly, gotta say a thank you to Evan from Analytic Flying. This article really tipped me off to all of this cargo stuff. Here's my model of a standard A321, be it Neo or the older CEO.
From my show and tell,
it has the capacity to fit 1, 2, 3, 8, 9. Where'd my 10th one go? Oh, wait, it's over here. 10 LD45s. Can you see them all in there? There's also a bit of extra space in the tail right here. They can fit some extra checked bags in there too. Now, the LR version of the A321neo gains its range through the use of these. I probably overcatted these a little bit, but these are auxiliary center tanks. Each one holds an additional 3,121 litres of fuel, or around 2,500 kilograms. Airlines can configure them with either 1, 2, or 3. So this will obviously increase the fuel capacity by 2,500, 5,000, or 7,500 kilograms. I believe in the case of Jetstar's A321LRs, they are using 2. Now, the big thing with these auxiliary center tanks is the loss of cargo space. You might be thinking, what is this weird piping that I've got going on here? That's because the first tank kind of takes up 2 slots, and then each additional tank takes up an additional cargo slot. So if an airline decides to use all 3 tanks, they'll lose out on 4 cargo slots. Likewise, if they're only going for 2 of these tanks, then they lose out on 3 cargo slots. It's worth mentioning too that these tanks are technically removable, so airlines can just take them all out and an LR kind of turns into just a normal A321neo. I believe this process is a little bit time consuming and complicated, so it's not something that you do very often. Now, the big difference with the XLR is the way that they pack in more fuel. Instead of going for these auxiliary center tanks, they've designed this. This is my interpretation of the rear center tank. Basically, it's baked into the fuselage of the plane and allows for another 13,100 liters of fuel or 10,500 kilograms, more than all 3 auxiliary center tanks combined. It is no longer removable, but unlike the auxiliary center tanks, it only takes up 2 cargo slots. How are they doing this? What's the magic here? How can you get more fuel and more cargo? Well, it's pretty simple really. All they're doing is utilizing all of the fuselage cross-section. These are just CAD models that I've done at home with my 3D printer, but you kind of get the point, right? Like they're utilizing pretty much all of the space, whereas this sort of has the framing to support the cargo containers and the ACTs. If anything, this XLR design kind of makes the LR pretty unappealing. You lose out on both cargo space and range when compared to the XLR. And I think this is exactly why Qantas has decided to go with this variant. It's hard to say exactly how much cargo space they're actually gaining here. If we're to guesstimate, I'm pretty sure these LD45s hold something like 35 bags. Bit more than that. So on their longer routes to Perth, they're probably using something like 5 of these LD45s for the bags, which allows them 3 LD45s for, say, Australia Post parcels, or whatever they're moving as a part of their freight business. If they had gone down the A321LR path and used these, then they would probably be limited to only being able to fit in 2 or maybe 1 LD45 for freight. So basically, the XLR with its rear center tank is the sort of fully optimized long-range version of the A321neo. And for Qantas specifically, it'll allow them to operate these sort of Brisbane to Perth and Sydney to Perth flights year-round, even with some of the craziest headwinds, without having to offload passengers or cargo.
Okay, so it's a few hours later now. I've done what I've needed to do in Sydney. It's time to head home. But earlier I said that there was an interesting backstory as to why Qantas flies the 737. Let's get into all of that now.
The way that Qantas came about originally operating the 737 is quite interesting in and of itself. If we turn the clocks back to 2001, the Australian domestic market was dominated by Qantas and Ansett. Qantas was primarily flying the 737-300s and 400s that they had inherited during the Australian Airlines TAA merger. I went into too much detail in this video about that. These jets weren't ancient at the time, but it was clear that they would need to be replaced sometime soon. They started to assess both the 737-800s from Boeing and the A320 from Airbus. On paper, they're pretty similar. They both seat around 170 people, they both have decent economics, and both would be solid options. But then 9/11 happened. For most of the world, this event led to a massive drop in passenger demand. Flights were cancelled, aircraft were grounded, and crucially, airlines start to defer and cancel orders for new planes. But in Australia, things are very different. Just 3 days after 9/11, ansett collapses. Qantas goes from having 60% of the domestic market to having over an 85% market share, almost overnight. Virgin Blue, as they were known at this point, were in their infancy. They had only 8 737s at the time of the collapse. They hardly had the capacity to fill the void. All of a sudden, Qantas was in desperate need for new jets. This Airbus versus Boeing decision turns from a who can give us the best deal on new jets into who can deliver us planes ASAP. Airbus did experience a dip in demand from 9/11, but their earliest delivery slots were still a few years away. Boeing, on the other hand, had jets available almost immediately. In October of 2001, Qantas placed an order for 15 737-800s, with options for another 60 down the line. And they were able to start to take delivery a mere 2 months later in January of 2002. So this is how we end up with Qantas operating 737-800s today. But this does raise another question. Jetstar, Qantas's low-cost subsidiary, why do they operate the A320s? Surely it would make more sense for them to operate the 737s. There would be pilot, crew, and maintenance synergies for the whole group that would save them tons of money. This is all probably true, but there was a bigger force at play here. The unions. By having Jetstar opt for the A320s, they were able to employ pilots and crew outside of the relatively expensive Qantas agreements. And there was no risk of a Qantas 737 pilot claiming rights to fly a Jetstar A320 route because Qantas pilots were simply not rated to fly the A320s. It was cunning and stingy, but probably necessary in order for Jetstar to truly operate as a low-cost carrier.
I want both of these.
Speaking of Jetstar, I actually took one of their A321LRs on the flight home. Funnily enough, they do actually use the range on these things. They've been used to practically replace all of the Dreamliners on flights to Bali. I guess freight isn't a huge part of the Jetstar business model. This, I know, is random, but the phone tablet holder thing is significantly better on Jetstar versus Qantas, all because it can double as a cup holder. Also, I didn't really touch on the actual cabins of the new Qantas XLR here. It wasn't really the main point of this video, but if you want to see more about that, then I'd highly recommend checking out my friend Steph's video on that. He did it a few weeks back, both economy and business. Economy was nice, business looks quite nice too. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed that one. I hope you learned something. If you did, I would appreciate it if you could subscribe. Also, go follow me on Instagram here and LinkedIn here. Go check out flightformula.com. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye.
Simon? Is that Simon?
What's Simon?
God, okay. That was a lot of 3D printing for 5 minutes.